For centuries and centuries and centuries in this country, when a man has, either sat next to a fire or stood up to tell stories, he's told stories of the Fionn and Fionn McCool, and you've all heard of those boys, haven't you? Yeah. Serious bunch of lads, serious bunch of lads. I'll just refresh your memory. If you can imagine like 300 Paul O'Connells, you'd be kind of on the right track. These guys, when the hills and plains were still covered with the trees, when the wild herds were like shrouds in the mountain tops, when heroism and magic was still deep in our soil, the Fionn held sway. And they had words which they said and lived by: Glynna in our gree, Neart in our gaig, agus Bart the rare our mriher. That is, purity in our hearts, strength in our limbs, and actions to suit our words. And they had a great life, it must be said. In the winter they'd stay in the castles, in the spring and summer out under the stars. And their job, of course, was to defend the coastline of Ireland from invaders, and their prize for same was the right to hunt in every copse and coppice, dell and dale, on every peak and plain. Theirs was the hunting there, and hunt they did, and their method was very interesting. Fionn would go to the top of the nearest hill, the Fionn would spread out below him. Each man would have 2 spears, a dagger and hounds beside him, and they would herd the wild beasts into the nearest forest, then put nets around the trees and tighten the ring, then unleash the hounds, and in they'd go baying, and the blood would soon flow. A bonfire would be built that night, and they would put everything on it for roasting. So it was crack with the lads in the day and barbecues at night. It was a pretty good lifestyle, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, the things that were needed to enter into the particular criteria, the conditions. Each man in the Fionn had to be able to recite 12 tomes of poetry by heart without missing as much as one word. If they did, they weren't allowed entry. Each man in the Fionn had to stand at some time in a pit, surrounded on top by 9 of his colleagues who would throw down spears. All he had to defend himself was a stick. If so much as one scratch was on him after that, he wasn't allowed entry into the Fionn. And of course, they had to be able to run through a wood with their hair bound up, and if one strand of hair became undone, if one twig was broken in the pursuit, of course they were caught, they weren't allowed entry into the Fionn. Now, at the time that Fionn and the Fionn were around, there are lots of stories about them. You possibly know the one about Oisín and Niamh Cíonóir and Tiernan. Do you know that one? Yeah. Sometimes I feel like Oisín because I too got married and never saw my friends again. But that's very much. That's not the story I want to tell you here tonight. I'd like to tell you a story, ladies and gentlemen, about a different lady, a lady by the name of Sadbh. And Sadbh was incredibly beautiful and renowned for this beauty. She was perfect in almost every feature: her shapely calves, her long, lithe limbs, her lustrous black hair, all perfect. But the most perfect of all of her features, black hair.
She knows her roots, black.
But the most perfect and attractive of her features were her deep, dark, beautiful brown eyes. So, because Sadbh was so beautiful and so famously so, people came from far and wide to court her to ask for her hand in marriage. And one man who came to do this was a man who was known as the Fear Dorcha. He was a sorcerer, a dree, as described in the old texts. And he came to ask for Sadbh's hand in marriage. Now, Sadbh also had a gift, and the gift was this: she could see into the heart of any man and know whether that heart was filled with good or evil. And when she met the Fear Dorcha, instantly she knew this was an evil man. And so when he asked her, "Sadbh, will you marry me?" "No, I'm afraid I can't," she replied. And flying into a rage, the Fear Dorcha said, "Well, if I can't have you, no one will." And he took out a magic wand and struck her with it. And she turned instantly from a woman into a deer. And the days passed, and the weeks passed, and the months passed, and so Sadbh lived out her days as a deer in the parklands surrounding the dún of the Fear Dorcha, the castle of the Fear Dorcha. Until, after about 3 years, one of the servants of this evil sorcerer, taking pity on poor Sadbh, came to her and said, "Sadbh, what you must do is this. Go to Doon Inn, to Alvin Lion, to the castle of Fionn McCool. And when you go over the threshold of that castle, the spell will be broken. Without further ado, Sadbh took off and travelled south, day after day, week after week, until she neared Fionn McCool's castle. Now it happened on the particular day that Sadbh was nearing the castle that Fionn and the Fianna and all of their hounds were out hunting. And Fionn and his two hounds, Brennan and Cillian, two very special hounds, were to the fore when they came to a clearing, and in the clearing, what did they see? Only Sadbh, the deer, in front of them. And Fionn immediately let loose the hounds, and Brennan and Cillian sprang forward, bounding and bounding and bounding, these muscle-bound, slavering hounds towards Sadbh. But Brennan and Cillian were special. Bran was in the lead, he was the faster of the two, and he knew, he recognized, he stopped dead and slid on his two paws. This was another magical creature, much like himself. And when Cillian arrived, he too stopped. And the rest of the hounds of the Fianna were coming bounding towards the deer, but Bran and Cillian stood Gardner, and they were quelled. And Fionn, taking in the scene, couldn't imagine what was happening. And yet, he and the Fianna, the hounds and the deer all returned to the castle that evening. And of course, when the deer went over the threshold, past the doors, turned instantly from a deer into a woman. And what a woman, as you're all aware, a woman perfect in every feature, her shapely calves, her long lithe limbs, her lustrous black hair, and of course, her most perfect feature, those deep, dark, beautiful brown eyes. Sure, Fionn hadn't a chance. He fell instantly, madly and deeply in love. And because of Sadbh's gifts, she could see straight into Fionn's heart. And this man, the captain of the Fianna, she knew that he was a good man. And so, as these things happen, they fell in love and they were married. And there was a feast and a fleadh for 10 days and 10 nights to celebrate the union. And they were busy nights, we'll put it that way. And of course, obviously then, as things happen, Sadbh fell pregnant. She was with child. Now I told you, ladies and gentlemen, that the job of the Fianna was to defend the coastline of Ireland. And one particular day, a messenger came to say that the Lochlannig had come inland in Ventry, down in Dingle, which is another long and excellent story, but not what I'm going to tell you now. And anyway, Fionn called his troops to him, and they set off south to defend the coastline of the country. And this left Sadbh alone, awaiting the return of her husband. And every day what she would do would be ascend to the top of the battlements and look out and await for her hero's return. And so, one evening, that's where we find her, on top of those battlements, looking out to the horizon. And with the setting of the sun, she saw in the distance the silhouette of a man who looked exactly like her husband, and left and right, there were the hounds, Bran and Cillian, and her heart leapt. She jumped for joy, ran down the steps from the battlements, out through the gate, and towards her husband. But as she neared this figure, the figures of the hounds disappeared. And as she drew closer, she realised it wasn't Fionn at all. It was the Far Durcha. "If I can't have you, no one will," he cried again, took out his wand, struck her, full agus full, and she was turned instantly from a woman into a deer. And sadly, ladies and gentlemen, there was no breaking this spell. And so off Sadbh took, travelling the country alone. A number of weeks later, Fionn returned to his castle. He came through the gates expecting a warm welcome from his wife. She wasn't there. When she wasn't, he asked the question, what happened? And he was told about the Far Durcha. Fionn wept, but soon gathered himself, called his troops to him again, and they set off, travelling north, south, east, west, day after day, week after week, month after month they searched. To no avail. 5 years passed, and not one day did Fionn rest. Until he came one day, with his hounds Bran and Cillian by his side, to a clearing in the woods. And there was a deer, dead on the ground. And a small boy, whose hands were wrapped around the neck of the deer, who was crying and crying and crying, out of deep, dark, beautiful brown eyes. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how Fionn McCool met his son Oisin.